If ever Paul had reason to be frustrated, it would have been that being in prison was keeping him from his plan to proclaim the gospel in unreached places. He had planned to go from Jerusalem to Spain, where the gospel had not yet been preached. But he was arrested in Jerusalem and imprisoned in Caesarea, and now he's in Rome awaiting trial. And yet, despite his plans being messed up, Paul rejoices. He says in Philippians 1, verse 12 to 18, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they could stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice." Paul rejoices because his imprisonment did not impede the progress of the gospel. In fact, his imprisonment served to advance the cause of the gospel. We don't know exactly how it happened, but Paul tells us that his imprisonment allowed for the whole Praetorian Guard in Rome to hear the gospel. D.A. Carson suggests that Paul was proving to be such an extraordinary prisoner that stories about him began to circulate around the palace. And not only stories about him, but the gospel story as well. Moreover, Paul's imprisonment inspired and emboldened other believers who were not in jail to proclaim the gospel. The bottom line is that Paul recognized that he might be in chains, but the gospel cannot be chained. He realized that God is still in control and was using his circumstances to advance the kingdom. And that's how we can rejoice too. We can rest in the sovereign providence of God, who is working out his purposes for our good and for his glory. The challenge is for us to submit to God's purposes. We might not see or understand what he's doing, but we can be sure God is still in control during this crisis. In fact, as far as God is concerned, this time is not a crisis. It's part of his master plan to advance his kingdom. For example, our fellowship church planters in Ontario report that people who normally would not come into the church building are joining church online. So the gospel is going out. And so perhaps, instead of complaining about being restricted, we need to be asking how God is opening opportunities for us to proclaim the gospel. That was Paul's response to his imprisonment. His priority was not his freedom. His focus was on the proclamation of Jesus. His plans might have been wrecked, but as long as the gospel was being spread, he could rejoice. And that should cause us to examine our own priorities. Has Christ's call to take up our cross and follow him so transformed our values that we have made Christ's purposes our own? Or are we still focused on our puny goals? A comfortable life, a good reputation, a flourishing career. See, unless we align our lives with God's glorious purposes, we'll always be frustrated. Joy is the byproduct of pursuing the right purposes. That's why Paul could even rejoice when people were proclaiming the gospel from wrong motives. Those people were probably trying to make Paul look bad and advance their own ministry and reputation. Unfortunately, selfishness and envy are continuing temptations for preachers. The author Paul Tripp warns pastors, pastoral ministry is always shaped, formed, directed, and driven by worship. Your ministry will be shaped by the worship of God or worship of you, or, for most of us, a troubling mix of both. Perhaps Perhaps there is no more powerful, seductive, and deceitful temptation in ministry than self-glory. Perhaps in ministry there is no more potent intoxicant than the praise of men, and there is no more dangerous form of drunkenness than to be drunk with your own glory. By the grace of God, Paul was able to protect himself from self-glory because he was focused on the advance of the gospel. He wasn't interested in promoting his own brand. So he is grieved by the selfish motives of preachers who were trying to make him look bad. But for as long as they were preaching Christ truthfully and accurately, he could rejoice. It wasn't about him. And that's where this pandemic should cause us to examine ourselves and our motivations. Are we frustrated because we don't get to do what we want? Have we fallen into the self-glory of thinking our plans have to be carried out? In other words, have we put ourselves in the place of God? Self-glory is a proven recipe for misery. Now, Paul's rejoicing doesn't necessarily mean he's happy. According to the New Testament scholar Frank Thielman, Paul's joy is not the self-satisfied delight that everything is going our way, but the settled peace that arises from making the gospel the focus of life and from understanding that God is able to advance the gospel under the most difficult circumstances. And that's how we ourselves will find joy in the midst of the difficulties brought on by this pandemic. We need to make the gospel the focus of our lives, trusting that God is in control, working out His purposes to advance His kingdom. And this pandemic is part of God's means to teach us to align ourselves to Him and to His purposes, so that we may have true, abiding joy. I hope you'll continue to follow our Thoughts in Captivity series. If you have any questions, you can email us at livinghopetoronto@gmail.com, and you can also subscribe to the Living Hope Baptist Church YouTube channel. We'd love for you to join us on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. for our live stream worship service. And Lord willing, we'll have the joy of meeting in the flesh in the near future.